reConstruct, where we are trying to rebuild something beautiful out of brokenness in our spiritual journey. And this is a wild ride through the book of Nehemiah, which I hope that you are enjoying. And we are just getting started. We'd love to have you along for the journey. You can find out all the details, the reading schedule, get more information and resources simply by visiting that website that's right on your screen there, go.christtable.today/reconstruct. And we would love to have you along for the ride on this journey. And we are really just getting into the very beginning of the study, and a lot of the themes that we've been talking about over the last few days and last week in the study, we're going to continue to see repeated, as though the writer of the story and maybe God himself is trying to impress upon us the truth as well as the lessons of this story. And so that's kind of one of the nice things, we're going to see a lot of review as we continue through this story. And with that introduction, why don't we just go ahead and jump in. Today we find ourselves with a little shorter reading plan than we had yesterday. That was quite a thing yesterday. An entire chapter 3. So now we find ourselves in chapter 4 and a little shorter reading today. And most days it'll be more like this in that it's short rather than long. Because none of us are able to give that amount of time to the day. And I'm also interested, I want to say this as we get into this, I'm also interested in seeing your big idea and your feedback about what you're seeing and what you're reading, what you're thinking. You may come to opposite conclusions of me, which is great, or you may find additional things in this text that I'm not finding. That's great as well. Or if you just want to say, hey, this is crazy, I've never seen this, but I totally agree. Who doesn't like to be agreed with as well? Nehemiah, I think, certainly liked being agreed with, and there is not a lot of that in today's passage as we begin. So let's dig in. Nehemiah, he has come back to his homeland from working a really cush job in the palace as cupbearer for the king of Persia. He has one responsibility from the king, and that is essentially to rebuild. But rather than rebuild everything and govern, Nehemiah is most interested in rebuilding the wall of protection around the city of Jerusalem. And that is the primary focus of the book of Nehemiah in the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, is the rebuilding of the wall. Now, it is questionable whether or not the rebuilding of the wall was primarily for security and protection from invading forces, or whether the rebuilding of the wall was primarily designed to keep out people they didn't like. It's likely the latter of the two, because they were in essentially a time of peace, living under Persian rule. All of the surrounding communities and nations had been conquered, and so there really was nobody around to invade Jerusalem. And so the rebuilding of the wall is, as we'd said yesterday, a bit of the middle finger, saying you may have conquered us and you may rule us, but you will not in any way, shape, or form be over us. And we also believe that the rebuilding of the wall is there in order to keep people from God. God has said that his idea for the return from exile would be that every nation, every tribe, every tongue would come to the city, to the high mountain, and worship him. And if there is a wall standing in between the temple of God and the high mountain that it sits on and everybody else, there's no access for them there. And what we sense in the book of Nehemiah is a desire for there to be limited access to God by Jews, and specifically what we're going to begin to see is limited access to God by Jews who were in captivity. We begin to see a bit of a chasm develop between the Jews who were in captivity and their experience and their community and their cohesion, and tension between those who did not end up going into captivity, who did not have that experience. And so why don't we just, without any further delay, jump into the text for today. And that rhymes. Sanballat, whose name is not unfamiliar to us if we've made the journey through the first 3 chapters, was very angry when he learned that we were rebuilding the wall. He flew into a rage and mocked the Jews, saying in front of his friends and the Samaritan army officers, "What does this bunch of poor, feeble Jews think that they are doing?" Sanballat was essentially Nehemiah's equal as governor of a bordering territory, but Nehemiah, he had a close relationship with the king of Persia, and so Nehemiah, in a sense, outranks Sanballat. Sanballat has multiple times previous to this expressed his dislike, dismay, and disdain for this rebuilding of the wall. And he's going to continue to amp up his frustration, now saying it not just to Nehemiah, but saying it in front of his friends and the army officers, letting everybody else know about his dislike for what's going on, the wall being rebuilt, and his reasoning for it. Poor, feeble Jews think they're doing not very nice. But he says something interesting here that I think is important for us to pay attention to. Do they think that they can rebuild the wall in a single day by just offering a few fat sacrifices? Do they actually think they can make something of stones from a rubbish heap, and charred ones at that? Now, I think that we can say that probably Sanballat was out of line in some of the ways that he said things, even if what he was saying was foundationally truthful, that they shouldn't be rebuilding the wall, or at least not for the reasons that they are. The way in which he said it, maybe it negates the things that he's saying. But it's interesting here that he says, do they think that they can rebuild the wall in a single day by offering a few sacrifices? What Sanballat is drawing into question here is the idea that, do they think that simply by doing some religious rhythm that God will help them build this wall? Do they really believe that by putting a few bucks in the offering plate, by making sure that they're there every time the doors are open, by handing a dollar bill or two out the window to the dude at the stop sign who's holding a cardboard sign with something written on it, do they really believe that serving once every few months in a food kitchen, do they really believe that taking their kids to vacation Bible school once a year, do they really believe that insert good work or insert religious rhythm, whatever it may be, is going to lure God into being amenable to the thing that they want? Is it going to appease God, make him happy, give him blessing, a few sacrifices? Sanballat, knowingly or not, appeals to a rationale that is rather present in both the Old and the New Testaments, in that God doesn't want your sacrifices. He wants you. He wants your full commitment, your full followership, your full obedience. Sanballat, to the Jews, to Nehemiah here, is an enemy of first order, of highest degree. Now he's not only questioned the building project of a wall, but he has now questioned their religious sales pitch for the wall. It's not just us who want this wall, Sanballat. It's God himself. You may dislike us, but are you going to confront God? You may not want this wall to be rebuilt, but are you going to stand in the way if God wants it? They had already made Sanballat out to be an enemy. People know whenever you dislike them. People know whenever you disregard them. People know whenever you see no value in their opinion, in their presence, in their existence. People know. It tends to create enemies unnecessarily. Sanballat and Tobiah, who we will hear from in just a few words, essentially by this point, so early in the process, have become the enemies of the wall, now of Nehemiah, because Nehemiah is personally invested in the wall, and of God, because God now has been inexorably linked to this wall project. And so, because Sanballat is an enemy of the wall, and it's God's wall, he must therefore be an enemy of God. We have to resist the urge of mistaking our enemies for God's enemies. This is something that we are all in danger of doing, and I might even say this is something that we all have done. We equate those who have disagreements with us to having disagreements with God. We equate those who have differences of opinion in our theologies to having differences of opinion to God. What, you don't like what I believe? Take it up with God. I'm going to ignore the fact that many people who are much wiser and closer to God spiritually than I actually agree with this other person, because it's all about whether or not they agree with me. And so I'm going to appeal to that higher power. It may well be that you're the enemy of God, not the other person. It may well be that neither one of you are the enemy of God. You just have a difference of opinion, and God just plain doesn't care. There's a danger in mistaking other people who disagree with us or who are disagreeable to us for being enemies with God, simply because we don't like them. We don't like what they're saying, and oftentimes we don't like it because there is a kernel or a world of truth in what is being said. We all do this. I see this happen actually a lot in religious contexts and in religious leadership. People who disagree with what the pastor thinks or what the pastor wants to do are seen as being not enemies of the idea or the theology, but as enemies of God. Have I fallen into this trap before? Shh. Yeah, I'm sure I have, and do, and will. Doesn't make it right. Don't mistake your enemies for God's enemies. Tobiah the Ammonite, who was standing beside him, remarked, "That stone wall would collapse if even a fox walked along the top of it." Not very nice to poke a caged bear. It can go very badly for you. Sanballat and Tobiah, in the beginning, may have acted well, but because they were continually shut down, the rhetoric gets stronger, crazier, and maybe even less becoming to somebody who is a follower of God. That, I think, we can agree on. What we also see here happening is that every major step forward in the wall draws an immediate and strong outside opposition. This is interesting because every time they take a step forward, there's opposition. What we read into that, I'm going to leave up to you. That could be the voice of God through the opposition trying to get the attention of Nehemiah and the leaders in Jerusalem, or it could well be that God is trying to get the attention of Sanballat and Tobiah and get them to see that this really is his project, that he has ordained this to be, and they need to just get on board. Then I prayed, this is Nehemiah, "Hear us, O God, for we are being mocked." I'm imagining Nehemiah praying this aloud in front of Sanballat, Tobiah, all the soldiers and the men who were around. You've heard these kinds of prayers. You've probably prayed these kinds of prayers. May their scoffing fall back on their own heads, and may they themselves become captives in a foreign land. May your family be raped and your ownings and belongings be pillaged. Sanballat and Tobiah may have been in the wrong for what they said, but it doesn't make Nehemiah in the right for taking it one step further. Do not ignore their guilt, he prays to God. Do not blot out their sins. He's big mad. For they have provoked you to anger here in front of the builders. Notice Nehemiah professes to understand God's feelings. Who's triggered here? Is it that they have provoked God to anger here in front of the builders? Or is it that they've provoked Nehemiah to anger in front of the builders, which may well have been their goal, to get under Nehemiah's skin in front of everybody, hoping that everybody would stand up to him? Doesn't work. It rarely works whenever somebody is willing to leverage God with the people for their plan. People aren't going to turn on Nehemiah because Nehemiah has already tied himself to being validated by God. This is why so many people have to simply walk away from church or faith or from pastors, from the religious context in which they live, because there is zero room for disagreement or questioning whenever the person at the helm is God's person. Whenever they leverage God in order to control, it becomes a toxic environment where people either drink the Kool-Aid or walk away. Nehemiah prays here what is called an imprecatory prayer, a specific type of prayer. We see this a lot in Psalms, mostly in Psalms, but an imprecatory prayer invokes judgment, calamity, destruction, curses, such as not being forgiven, suffering eternal torment, invokes these things upon one's enemies or those perceived as the enemies of God, which is specifically what Nehemiah does here. It's not okay when people do that in churches. It's not okay when people do that in faith communities, and it's not okay when Nehemiah does it here. Not all crusades are holy ones. Nehemiah is on a crusade to build a wall And I think Nehemiah is on a crusade to crush the resistance. Right now, that resistance is tied up in this personification of Sanballat and Tobiah as being against God. But as we're going to move forward, we're going to see that this resistance is also seen in anybody who questions Nehemiah or does anything that Nehemiah sees as being out of line or standing in the way of him, standing in the way of people coming to God. It's not a holy crusade ever whenever we keep people from God. Nehemiah's on a crusade. It's not a holy one. And it's going to change the trajectory, not just of Nehemiah's life in Jerusalem in this moment, but the rhetoric and crusade that Nehemiah is on with this wall, both literally and the metaphorical wall, is going to create an environment that remains for hundreds, 1,000+ years. It's going to create the environment that Jesus walks into with the Pharisees, with the Sadducees, with the religious elitism, with seeing themselves as being better than, more holy than others as children of God, and everybody else who isn't Jewish as being an outsider or a Gentile. Holy crusades have consequences. Until tomorrow, happy reading.